What follows is an updated analysis of the state of the United States economy and important measurements of the overall strength of our society. Within this presentation, I provide what I believe are a number of reasoned recommendations for changes in public policy to address the boom-to-bust character of our economic system and the growing level of income and wealth inequality that threatens our very democracy. Additional proposals for systems change are offered to achieve sustainable use of our natural resources. More than ever before, we are a society divided over whether and how we can create sufficient employment opportunities for a growing population at living wages and with measures in place that will not merely reduce but actually eliminate environmental degradation. When one examines what occurs in the real world, there is strong evidence that economic theory is in need of correction, and that public policies derived from accepted theory must be changed. I will explore these issues further as I proceed. It is no secret that the discipline of economics has been the subject of increasing criticism for the failure of most economists to provide meaningful insights into the causes of our boom-to-bust prone economic system. For many reasons, economics has long been referred to as the dismal science, or as not a science at all. The list of critics of economics as a discipline and of its value in the real world is long and growing, from within and without the discipline. One of the most vocal critics today is Professor Steve Keen of Kingston University, London, author of Debunking Economics, in which he writes, "If you look at mainstream economics, there are three things you will not find in a mainstream economic model: banks, debt, and money. How anybody can think they can analyze capital while leaving out banks, debt, and money is a bit, to me, like an ornithologist trying to work out how a bird flies whilst ignoring that the bird has wings." An important question I would put to Professor Keen is his definition of capital. Economists and their predecessor political economists too often fail to explain what they meant when they wrote about capital. Actual capital goods, buildings, machinery, technologies have characteristics quite distinct from currency or its digital equivalent, or what is broadly thought of as financial capital. The failure to make these distinctions makes scientific analysis impossible. Another problem is the interpretation of statistics. Economists and most mainstream analysts consistently point to the measurement labeled gross domestic product to indicate the extent to which our economy is growing. An increase in GDP is automatically considered a positive indicator. In reality, relying on GDP as a measurement of the health of the economy or the well-being of our society is problematic. GDP includes all spending by government regardless of the source of funding, whether from taxes, borrowing, or monetary expansion by the Federal Reserve System. More than this, there is no qualitative judgment regarding what the spending is for. A change in the calculation of real GDP from using 2009 dollars to using 2012 dollars and a reduction in the inflation index used for real GDP calculation by the Bureau of Economic Analysis resulted in a $952 billion adjustment from a first quarter initial figure of 17.37 trillion to a revised figure of 18.32 trillion. An important issue for policymakers is the extent to which government borrowing crowds out private sector access to affordable credit. The total debt owed by the U.S. government reached $22 trillion during February of 2019 and is projected to hit $27 trillion by 2023. However, the massive infusion of new money into the U.S. economy by the Federal Reserve and historically low rates of interest has more than offset federal borrowing. Here's a quick snapshot of total consumer debt at the end of the second quarter of 2019. This is a new record. Consumer spending accounts for nearly 70% of the economy as measured by GDP. Within the political arena, there continues to be great discussion and debate over stimulating the economy by a massive infusion of spending to repair and rebuild the nation's infrastructure. This will certainly create employment and profits for businesses. Where will the funding come from? Every public investment in infrastructure results in windfall gains to owners of adjacent and nearby locations. The public capture of these gains could significantly lower the amount of debt incurred by infrastructure spending. However, because of the almost universally low rate of taxation on land rent, the not so positive side effect of infrastructure spending is rising land costs that translate into a rising cost of doing business and a rising cost of living for residents. It is worth taking a moment to provide an important insight into economic theory. Every parcel or tract of land has some potential annual rental value, that is, what the land would bring to its owner under an annually adjusted lease payment. After subtracting whatever annual property tax payment is required, the owner experiences a net imputed income stream capitalized by market forces into a potential selling price for the land. The higher the annual tax payment, the lower the imputed income stream to be capitalized. Conversely, the lower the effective rate of taxation, the higher will be the land prices, all other things being equal. A longer-term risk of government borrowing facilitated by adding to the money supply by quantitative easing is the prospect for hyperinflation. However, the willingness of external trading partners to hold U.S. dollars or invest them in U.S. property markets and corporate shares has supported the exchange value of U.S. currency, at least to this point in time. Absent systemic reforms, the economic tools available to government and the Federal Reserve to respond to the threat of hyperinflation are rather limited. The Federal Reserve can raise the rate of interest charged to member banks, which will then find their way through the economy and to yields on new issues of government securities. The risk, of course, is a recessionary downturn. How government at all levels raises needed revenue has huge but largely ignored implications for the health of our society. Specific public policies, including taxation policies, create monopolies and quasi-monopolies that impose what are called deadweight losses on asset production and economic output. Counterproductive policies result in a lower value of goods and services produced and higher prices than would have occurred absent these policies. I have come to agree with those economists who argue that only the taxation of land value, or more specifically the taxation of the potential annual rental value of land, and land-like assets, such as frequencies on the broadcast spectrum, impose no deadweight loss on economic output. Professor Fred Foldvari of San Jose State University explains the consequences of our current public revenue system and what the elimination of deadweight losses would do for the economy and our society. The overall excess burden of taxation in the USA has been estimated at about $1.5 trillion, more than 10% of total output. So roughly, our standard of living would be 10% higher if the deadweight loss were eliminated. He goes on to make the case for the elimination of most other taxes. With the elimination of taxes on wages, sales, buildings, and entrepreneurial profits, the economy would take a quantum leap up to dazzling productivity. The demand for labor would surge and wages would jump to now unimaginable levels. Several decades ago, another economist, Milton Friedman, advanced the same change in tax policy. There's a sense in which all taxes are antagonistic to free enterprise, and yet we need taxes. In my opinion, the least bad tax is the property tax on the unimproved value of land. He adds, governments can collect taxes best on things that don't move. Land is an ideal basis of taxation because you can't take it away. A low effective annual tax on the potential rental value of locations in our towns and cities, on natural resource laden land, and other natural assets generates this income stream. The result is intense speculation in land and high land acquisition costs for development of housing, for resource development, and other uses, even as huge areas of land in a community remain vacant. Access to cheap credit adds fuel to already speculation-driven land markets. Land prices eventually reach a level where businesses can no longer absorb the cost pushed through to office, commercial, and retail rents, and a growing number of households can no longer qualify for the mortgage financing to acquire housing. The resulting stress of rising land prices brings on a property market crash every 18 to 20 years. Australian analyst Philip Anderson detailed this cyclical activity in his 2005 book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. He wrote, "A study of U.S. history reveals a very clear average 18-year cycle in U.S. real estate prices, measured from trough to trough or peak to peak. The actual cycle has never been shorter than 17 years, never longer than 21. Unfortunately, few policy analysts and even fewer of the nation's elected representatives have come to terms with the nation's counterproductive tax structure that is at the heart of our boom-to-bust economic system. Fairness is one issue. Economic efficiency is the other. On these matters, there are widely diverse opinions and very powerful vested interests doing all they can to preserve the subsidies by which they benefit. The 2017 tax bill signed by President Trump does not, in my opinion, address any of these fundamental problems for the simple reason that there is no distinction made between income that is rent-derived and therefore unearned and income earned producing goods or delivering services. In fact, unearned income receives even more advantageous tax treatment. With this as an introduction, let's look in some detail at the most important segments of our society and at the benchmarks of who owns what and how income is distributed in our society. First, we examine the state of manufacturing in the United States.